Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today, and congratulations Susan and your board on forming this group, this network. Fantastic. Long overdue, really. And I might say in passing, there are more Palestinian Christians outside of Palestine, sadly, than there are now in Palestine. When I first went to Palestine, as a very young person, around about 20% of the population was Christian. Now it's very hard to actually get a figure on the census of those who are Palestinian Christian in Palestine. So you who live outside Palestine have a big responsibility. I'll come back to it in a moment. I'd like also to honour the indigenous people of this land, both their elders past, present and emerging, and to make the point, the obvious point, that of all the Australian population, you Palestinians and the First Nations people of Australia have an enormous amount in common. And it's a very good thing that there is a growing alliance between Australian Palestinians and Australian Indigenous people, because you share the same journey. As is already been mentioned, I began my association with Palestine by teaching Palestinians. You just heard I taught Old Testament, and it's a bit like, to be quite frank, it's very hard to teach somebody their own photograph album. And when I taught Palestinians the Old Testament, it's like telling them their own story, and which is true. To give you a small example, in the prophet Isaiah, there is a passage about Zion. And Zion in the prophet Isaiah is not about a home city for Jews. It is a holy place to which all the nations of the earth should come. And you Palestinians over centuries have welcomed people from all over the world to Jerusalem al-Quds. And I look forward to the day when it is again a truly international city. Thank God that the Australian Parliament has reversed a decision of the Morrison government in that regard. In teaching, by the way, one of my students was Professor Bassam Dali's cousin, Hannah Dali, who is now an Anglican priest in the Galilee. And to illustrate for those who've not been to Palestine what it is like to be in Palestine today if you're a Palestinian, I met Hannah and his lovely wife in Ramallah, and we journeyed back to Jerusalem. And when we came to the checkpoint, his wife had to get out of the car. Hannah could stay in the car. Why? Because she was born in Jordan, he was born in Jerusalem, and they have two separate sets of paper. And it's the same for Palestinians all the time. They are discriminated against by their identity. And it would be outrageous in any other country of the world for that to be so. I want to say a few relatively hard things. The first is this. It is the reality that in the United States of America, and to a lesser degree in Australia, that permission for Israel to behave as it does is comforted in both countries by the Christian community. That is a fact. In the United States of America, it is the Christian right that supported Trump. It is the Christian right that actually puts forward the proposition that Israel has the right to the land from the river to the sea. And it is the Christian right in Australia that also influenced the Morrison government. It is the Christian right that has tried its very best to put forward the view that Israel should be a friend of Australians no matter what they do. And so I want to put it to you tonight that you, the Palestinian Christians, you have a responsibility in Australia that is not there for those who are Muslim. As Christians, you can influence the decision makers of Australia, and you should take courage to do so. I was struck by Susan's comments earlier about her experience of the lockdown and how it reminded her of what happened in being in an occupied land. And when I first began as the president of the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network, it was true that we had great difficulty in getting Palestinians to put their heads above the parapet. But it is less so now, thank God. And one of the reasons why is we have lobbied very hard and worked very hard, and it is now the fact that around about 70% of the Australian population understands the injustice that Palestinians suffer. So there is no need to be afraid to put your head up, put your hand up. You'll be in the majority. You'll be supported by the majority. That used not to be the case. I am particularly encouraged by the reality that the Palestinian youngsters are now putting their heads up and their hands up. I had the privilege the other day of visiting the University of Sydney, and I had with me a young Palestinian intern. She's a student at New South Wales University, and we went to Sydney University with a meeting with the Vice-Chancellor to say to him, you should not sign up to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. The reason why is because it prevents free speech, and it actually prevents people speaking up against the atrocities of Israel against the Palestinians. The statement itself is actually quite innocuous, but the examples around the statement make it clear that you are anti-Semitic if you actually speak against Israel. This young Palestinian, she absolutely gave it to the Vice-Chancellor, and he said, under his watch, the University of Sydney will not sign up to the IHRA. You, my friends, need to continue to do that work because the lobby is working very hard to make sure governments, government agencies, universities all sign up to that document. And if it is signed by everybody, then I, amongst many other people, are anti-Semitic. I am not anti-Semitic. I'm not anti-Jew, but I am anti the Zionist behaviour that actually discriminates against you Palestinians. It's very important for the voice to be uniform across the country, and I do encourage you, particularly in your churches, to exercise your voice, because unfortunately some well-meaning Christian people think that as Christians we should be supporting Israel. We should be supporting Jews, we should be supporting Muslims, we should be supporting all people, but we should not be supporting a regime that is racist. And the current...
Amen to that.
Israel has just elected a new parliament, and Netanyahu, if he puts his numbers together, has to include members of what is called a religious Zionist party. And in that party there is a gentleman who wishes to be either the defence minister or the police minister, and his statements are entirely racist. He would wipe out Palestinians from the river to the sea. So it is incredibly important that we stand up and have our voice within the churches. Could I also say, while I'm on this point, that people, lots and lots and lots of churches take pilgrimage people to Palestine. I have done it myself on several occasions. But unlike somebody like myself who's got a little bit of inside knowledge, most Christian leaders take pilgrim groups to Israel, assuming they're getting a fair run of the mill. But in actual fact, they are taken by Israeli guides to the Palestinian territory. So when they're taken, for example, by Palestinian guides to see the the Church of the Holy Nativity in Bethlehem, for example. They are taken from Jerusalem in their air-conditioned bus. They don't have to go through the checkpoint down below. They go through on their air-conditioned bus into Bethlehem. They go to the Church of the Holy Nativity, and then they go home. And then they buy their souvenirs in an Israeli shop. They do not buy their souvenirs in Bethlehem. So it is very, very important that you guys, who actually I'm sure know churches who take pilgrimages, that you make sure that they have a Palestinian guide and they do a Palestinian tour. While I'm on that subject, ladies and gentlemen, there are a number of politicians here. I don't know them all, but I do know some of them. And most of them, I'm sure, are very friendly. But the reality is, I don't know whether you know this or not, the reality is more Australian politicians on both sides of politics, from state and federal government, more go to Israel than any other country in the world by a country mile. Why? We don't have a lot of trade with Israel. Why do we do that? The reason why is because, sponsored by the Zionist organisation, the idea is to get the decision makers of Australia to go to Israel in order to get the Israeli narrative rather than your narrative. And there are obviously two narratives. But it is right that you guys are the original Christians. You were there on the day of Pentecost. Your great whoever's were there then. And you have been there ever since. And you are still there. Because you are still there, you are winning. Now, my wife said, look, I talk too much, and I should look at my watch. I've got a couple of other things to say. I don't know what you think about the politics in the Middle East, in Israel and in Palestine, but I need to tell you this, that currently Israel has created one state. It has created one state because it entirely controls Gaza. I don't know whether you read the paper yesterday, but Gazans cannot sell fish into West Bank, let alone to Israel, into the West Bank, because the Israel Parliament has decided they shouldn't do that. Israel controls Gaza, it controls the West Bank, it controls East Jerusalem, and of course it controls the Palestinians, who are 20% of the population of Israel itself. Yes, yeah, exactly.
No one can go outside Gaza.
No, that's exactly right. And the reason why is because Israel controls it. So there is one state, and it is an apartheid state. And you should not be afraid to use that language, because it is the truth. Before they died, Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela both said that the apartheid regime in Israel was actually more severe than the apartheid regime in South Africa. Why? Because in Israel you are gradually being pushed and pushed and pushed away from your own land. You live under military rule, whereas the illegal settlers live under civil rule, and Israel is supported by the strongest, wealthiest, most powerful country in the world. So I know that politicians overall do not like the word, but it is truthful. There is no other word that adequately describes Israel. One of my most moving moments, but I've been so many times, it's now difficult. I like to go into Palestine from Jordan across the King Hussein Bridge, but it is now more difficult for me to do that because they know who I am. But one of my most interesting visits was to see our head Tamimi in her village just north of Ramallah. And I don't know whether you know or not, she's just published a book called They Called Me a Lioness. And I recommend that you get her book. But when I went to see Ahid Tamimi and her father Qassam Tamimi, you might remember when she was 15, she slapped an Israeli soldier in the face who just shot her cousin. And their house on the West Bank is under permanent order of demolition. A house they've lived in well before 1967, well way back. But as you know, it is the policy of the Israeli government to actually to depopulate the Palestinian community out of the whole of the West Bank, really. That's it, and to push everybody into what would be in South Africa terms Bantustans around Jenin and Zabda and Nablus and Ramallah, etc. That's what Israel would consider to be a two-state solution. But when I saw Ahid Tamimi, she spent some time in jail. I think I saw her when she was about 17 years old. She said, I do not hate the Jews. I do not hate anybody. I just want to live with everybody. I want to live as everybody else lives. I want to be able to work where everybody else works, learn as everybody else learns, and speak as everybody else speaks. Is that too much to ask? And I say to myself, no, it is not too much to ask. You Palestinians deserve to live as everybody else deserves to live. And while I have breath, I'll finish up by saying this. My talk is called Breaking Bread. And in 1975, I broke bread with 5 Palestinian young men. And in my religion, which is your religion, if you break bread with people, you are bound to them for the rest of your life. Goodbye.